The winter of 1886 arrived like a savage beast across the American Southwest. Snow fell in torrents that had not been seen for decades, blanketing the desert landscapes in white death. The temperature plummeted to levels that froze rivers solid and turned the breath of men into clouds of ice crystals. This was not the gentle winter that the region usually experienced, but a merciless assault from nature itself. Geronimo and his band of Apache warriors had been running for months, pursued relentlessly by the United States Army. They had chosen to make their stand in the Dragoon Mountains of Arizona, a rugged terrain they knew better than any white soldier ever could. The rocky outcroppings and hidden caves provided shelter, but nothing could have prepared them for the fury of this particular winter. The Apache people had lived in harmony with the harsh desert environment for centuries. They understood the land, knew every water source, every edible plant, and every safe passage through the mountains. But this winter tested even their legendary survival skills. The snow covered their traditional food sources, and the cold was so intense that even the hardiest among them struggled to maintain body heat. Captain James Morrison of the 4th Cavalry had been tracking Geronimo for 3 months. He was a seasoned military officer who had served in the Civil War and had experience fighting various Native American tribes. Morrison believed that winter would be his greatest ally in this campaign. He reasoned that the harsh conditions would force the Apache to surrender or face starvation and death from exposure. The military strategy was simple but brutal. Rather than engage in direct combat, which had proven costly and ineffective against the Apache in the past, Morrison decided to wait. He positioned his troops at key locations around the mountain range, creating a loose but effective perimeter. The plan was to let nature do what bullets and bayonets had failed to accomplish. Morrison had underestimated the Apache spirit and their deep connection to the land. While his own soldiers struggled with the cold, requiring constant supplies of food, warm clothing, and firewood, the Apache seemed to move through the winter landscape like ghosts. They had learned to read the weather patterns, to find shelter in places that white men would never think to look, and to survive on resources that others would overlook. The Apache women played a crucial role in their survival. They gathered what edible plants remained under the snow, prepared traditional remedies to ward off illness, and maintained the spiritual practices that kept their people's morale strong. The children, despite the harsh conditions, were taught the old ways by their elders, ensuring that their culture would survive even if they did not. Geronimo himself was past 60 years old, but the winter seemed to energize rather than weaken him. He moved through the snow-covered terrain with the agility of a man half his age, constantly scouting for threats and opportunities. His presence alone was enough to inspire his followers to endure hardships that would have broken lesser men. As the days turned into weeks, Morrison began to realize that his strategy might not be working as planned. His own men were suffering from frostbite, illness, and low morale. Supply lines were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the snow continued to fall and the temperature remained dangerously low. The Apache, meanwhile, had transformed their temporary refuges into sustainable winter camps. They used their knowledge of the land to create shelters that conserved heat effectively, found ways to hunt game that other predators had overlooked, and maintained a network of communication that allowed them to coordinate their movements across the mountainous terrain. The winter was becoming more than just a seasonal challenge. It was evolving into a weapon that both sides were trying to wield. For the Army, it was supposed to be the force that would finally bring Geronimo to his knees. For the Apache, it became another element of their homeland that they could turn to their advantage, just as they had done with the desert heat, the rocky terrain, and the sparse water sources. 3 weeks into the siege, the first soldier died from exposure. Private Thomas Bradley, barely 19 years old, had volunteered for night watch duty despite showing early signs of illness. His body was found the next morning, frozen solid in his position, rifle still clutched in his stiffened hands. The sight sent shockwaves through Morrison's command. The death forced Morrison to confront a harsh reality. His men were not equipped for extended winter warfare in this terrain. Their standard-issue winter gear, designed for campaigns in more temperate climates, proved inadequate against the brutal cold of the high desert mountains. Frostbite was becoming epidemic among the troops, and several men had already lost fingers and toes to the cold. Dr. Samuel Harrison, the unit's medical officer, approached Morrison with grim statistics. Nearly 40% of the men were showing signs of cold-related injuries or illness. Food rations were running low because supply wagons could not navigate the snow-covered mountain roads. The horses were suffering as much as the men, with several animals already lost to the extreme conditions. In stark contrast, the Apache seemed to be thriving in their mountain stronghold. Scouts reported seeing smoke from their fires, but when soldiers investigated, they found only cold ashes and no trace of recent habitation. The Apache had mastered the art of concealment so completely that they could maintain warmth and comfort while remaining virtually invisible to their pursuers. Naiche, Geronimo's nephew and a skilled warrior in his own right, had taken responsibility for maintaining the group's mobility. He had organized a system of rotating camps, moving the band every few days to prevent the army from pinpointing their location. Each move was carefully planned to take advantage of natural wind breaks, hidden water sources, and defensive positions. The Apache had also begun psychological warfare against their enemies. They would leave signs of their presence just close enough to army positions to unnerve the soldiers, but never close enough to invite attack. Tracks in the snow that led nowhere, smoke signals that appeared and disappeared, and the occasional glimpse of a figure moving through the trees kept the soldiers in a constant state of tension. Lieutenant Robert Collins, one of Morrison's most experienced officers, began to question the wisdom of continuing the campaign. He had fought in several Indian wars and had never encountered such resilient opposition. The Apache were not just surviving the winter. They were using it as cover for operations that would have been impossible in warmer weather. The psychological pressure on the army troops was mounting daily. Men who had been confident at the beginning of the campaign were now jumping at shadows and reporting phantom Apache sightings. Sleep deprivation, caused by the extreme cold and constant vigilance, was affecting decision-making at every level of command. Morrison received a message from his superiors demanding progress reports and casualty figures. The telegram, delivered by a half-frozen courier who had risked his life to reach the remote outpost, contained an implicit threat. The Army High Command was losing patience with the extended campaign and the mounting costs in men and materials. Meanwhile, the Apache were adapting their traditional survival techniques to the extreme conditions. They had learned to create warming fires that produced minimal smoke, to find game animals that had taken shelter in caves and rock formations, and to preserve meat in the natural refrigeration provided by the intense cold. The women of the band had become expert at treating cold-related injuries using traditional plant medicines and techniques passed down through generations. They created warming poultices from pine needles and other available materials, and developed methods for maintaining circulation in extremities that prevented the kind of frostbite that was decimating the army ranks. As the fourth week of the siege began, it became clear that the winter that Morrison had hoped would be his ally was instead becoming his greatest enemy. The Apache understanding of their environment was proving superior to all the military training and equipment that the United States Army could bring to bear against them. Children in the Apache camp, who should have been the most vulnerable to the harsh conditions, were instead learning valuable lessons about survival and resistance. They watched their elders turn adversity into advantage and learned that the land itself could be their greatest protector when they understood how to work with it rather than against it. The breaking point came during the fifth week when a blizzard struck with unprecedented fury. The storm lasted for 3 days and nights, with winds so strong they could knock a grown man off his feet and snow falling so heavily that visibility dropped to mere inches. For Morrison's troops, huddled in their inadequate shelters, it felt like the end of the world. When the storm finally cleared, Morrison discovered that he had lost contact with 2 of his outlying positions. Search parties sent to investigate found the camps abandoned, with clear signs that the soldiers had retreated to lower elevations to escape the worst of the weather. The carefully planned perimeter around the Apache stronghold had collapsed. More devastating was the discovery that during the storm, the Apache had somehow managed to raid the Army's main supply depot. They had taken food, ammunition, and most critically, warm clothing and blankets. The raid had been executed with such precision that the guards never saw their attackers, and no shots were fired. It was as if the Apache had materialized from the storm itself. Geronimo had personally led the supply raid, using the blizzard as perfect cover for the operation. His intimate knowledge of the terrain, allowed him to navigate through conditions that would have been impossible for anyone less familiar with the land. The success of the raid boosted morale among his followers and provided crucial resources for their continued resistance. The psychological impact on the army was devastating. Soldiers who had believed they were besieging the Apache began to realize that they were the ones truly under siege. The Apache could strike at will and disappear without trace, while the army was trapped in fixed positions that were becoming more untenable with each passing day. Morrison faced a crisis of command. His officers were beginning to openly question orders, and some were suggesting that they should withdraw to lower elevations and wait for spring. The idea of being defeated by weather and a handful of Apache warriors was humiliating, but the alternative might be the complete destruction of his command. Dr. Harrison reported that gangrene was setting in among several of the frostbite victims. Without proper medical facilities and supplies, men were going to start dying not from enemy action, but from the simple inability to stay warm and dry. The doctor warned that continued exposure could result in casualties that would dwarf any losses from actual combat. The Apache, in contrast, were using the harsh conditions to their advantage in ways that seemed almost supernatural to their enemies. They had developed techniques for moving across snow that left minimal tracks, for finding shelter in rock formations that appeared barren to untrained eyes, and for maintaining fires that somehow remained invisible to Army scouts. Lozin, a respected Apache warrior woman and medicine person, had taken charge of weather prediction for the band. Her ability to read natural signs allowed the Apache to prepare for storms before they hit, and to time their movements to take advantage of weather patterns. This knowledge gave them a significant tactical advantage over their enemies. The children in the Apache camp had become an integral part of the survival effort. They were used as scouts and messengers, their small size allowing them to move through terrain that would challenge adults. They also helped with food gathering and preparation, learning skills that would serve them throughout their lives. Morrison received another telegram from Army headquarters, this one with more urgent language. The High Command was concerned about reports of the failed siege and the mounting casualties. There were political pressures to end the campaign quickly, as newspapers back east were beginning to report on the difficulties the Army was experiencing. The Apache leadership held a council to discuss their strategy going forward. While they were successfully resisting the Army siege, they knew that their situation remained precarious. Ammunition was limited, and despite their successful raid, food supplies were still a concern. The winter was far from over, and they needed to plan for the long term. Geronimo spoke to his followers about the spiritual significance of their resistance. He reminded them that their ancestors had faced similar challenges and had survived through their connection to the land and their faith in the traditional ways. The winter was not just a physical challenge but a test of their spiritual strength and cultural identity. The Army's morale continued to deteriorate as more men fell victim to cold-related injuries and illnesses. What had begun as a confident military operation was turning into a desperate struggle for survival. The hunters had become the hunted, and the winter that was supposed to be their ally had revealed itself as an implacable enemy that recognized no flag or uniform. By the 6th week, Morrison was forced to make a decision that would haunt his military career forever. He ordered a partial withdrawal of his forces to lower elevations, effectively admitting that the Apache had won this round of their long conflict. The decision came after losing 3 more men to exposure and receiving reports that several others were unlikely to survive without immediate medical attention. The retreat was a disaster that compounded the Army's humiliation. Soldiers struggling with frostbite and exhaustion found it nearly impossible to navigate the treacherous mountain paths while carrying their wounded comrades. Equipment had to be abandoned, and at several points, the column came under harassment from Apache warriors who seemed to appear and disappear like spirits in the snow. Lieutenant Collins, leading the rear guard during the retreat, witnessed firsthand the Apache mastery of winter warfare. They struck at the most vulnerable moments, when soldiers were struggling with difficult terrain or dealing with medical emergencies. Yet they never engaged in prolonged combat, preferring to inflict psychological damage and then vanish before effective retaliation was possible. The Apache tactics during the retreat demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of both military strategy and human psychology. They created an atmosphere of constant threat without exposing themselves to significant risk. Every soldier in Morrison's command understood that they were being watched and that the Apache could strike at any moment they chose. Geronimo himself was reportedly seen during one of these harassment attacks, appearing briefly on a ridge above the retreating column before disappearing into the swirling snow. His presence served as a powerful reminder that despite months of pursuit and the harsh winter conditions, the Apache leader remained free and defiant. The news of Morrison's partial retreat spread quickly through military channels and eventually reached newspaper reporters back east. The story of a handful of Apache warriors successfully resisting a large army force during one of the worst winters in recent memory captured public imagination and became a source of embarrassment for military leaders. Meanwhile, the Apache had used the breathing space provided by the Army's withdrawal to strengthen their mountain positions and gather additional resources. They had discovered new cave systems that provided better shelter and had located water sources that remained unfrozen even in the extreme cold. The band had also made contact with other Apache groups who provided intelligence about Army movements and additional supplies. This network of support demonstrated that despite their isolation in the mountains, Geronimo's followers were not completely cut off from the broader Apache resistance. Women in the Apache camp had developed innovative techniques for preserving and preparing food under winter conditions. They created methods for smoking meat that worked effectively in cold weather and developed ways to process traditional plant foods that remained nutritious. Despite the harsh storage conditions, the psychological impact of their successful resistance was profound among the Apache. Stories of their winter stand against the Army spread throughout Native American communities across the Southwest, inspiring others to resist forced relocation to reservations. The winter siege became a symbol of indigenous resilience and determination. Morrison, now dealing with the political fallout from his failed campaign, received orders to maintain surveillance of the Apache position while avoiding direct confrontation. The Army High Command had decided that the cost of continuing the winter campaign was too high, both in terms of casualties and public relations. Dr. Harrison filed a detailed report on the medical consequences of the winter campaign, documenting cases of severe frostbite, pneumonia, and other cold-related conditions that had affected nearly every man in the command. His report would later be used to improve Army winter warfare protocols. But it came too late to help Morrison's reputation. The Apache leadership began planning for the eventual end of winter and the resumption of more active resistance. They knew that spring would bring renewed military pressure, but they had proven to themselves and their enemies that they could survive and fight effectively under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Nightshade organized hunting parties that ranged further from the main camp, taking advantage of the Army's reduced presence to gather food and scout for potential threats. These expeditions also served to maintain the warriors' combat readiness and morale during the long winter months. The success of their winter resistance had a transformative effect on the Apache band. Warriors who had initially been demoralized by months of pursuit now felt renewed confidence in their ability to continue fighting. The winter had tested their resolve and strengthened their unity as a people. As winter deepened into its 7th week, an unexpected development changed the dynamics of the standoff entirely. A massive avalanche, triggered by the combined weight of accumulated snow and the vibrations from Army artillery practice, blocked the main pass that the military had been using for supply deliveries. The thunderous roar of falling snow and rock could be heard for miles across the mountain range. The avalanche effectively cut Morrison's remaining forces off from regular resupply, creating a crisis that threatened to turn his surveillance mission into a survival ordeal. The blocked pass would take weeks to clear, and alternative routes were either too dangerous for heavy wagons or already impassable due to snow accumulation. For the Apache, however, the avalanche was a gift from the mountain spirits. They knew secret paths that remained open, routes that had been used by their people for generations and were invisible to outsiders. The natural disaster that threatened to destroy their enemies actually increased their own strategic advantage. Geronimo saw the avalanche as a sign that the land itself was fighting alongside his people. He called it a message from the ancestors, proof that their cause was just and that nature would assist those who lived in harmony with the earth. This interpretation strengthened the spiritual resolve of his followers and reinforced their determination to continue. resisting. The Apache began using their knowledge of the alternative routes to conduct more aggressive raids against isolated army positions. They could strike quickly and retreat through passages that their enemies couldn't follow, making it seem as though they possessed supernatural abilities to move through impassable terrain. Morrison found himself in an increasingly desperate situation. His remaining forces were running low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The cold-related casualties continued to mount, and several men were showing signs of scurvy due to the lack of fresh food in their diet. The officer who had once been confident of victory was now fighting just to keep his command intact. The psychological pressure on both sides intensified as the isolation became complete. Army soldiers, cut off from communication with the outside world, began to exhibit signs of what would later be recognized as combat stress reactions. Some men reported seeing Apache warriors where none existed, while others became paranoid about attacks that never materialized. Lieutenant Collins, now effectively second in command due to the illness of other officers, began to question whether the mission had any realistic chance of success. He had seen too many good soldiers broken by the combination of cold isolation and constant threat to believe that continuing the campaign served any useful purpose. The Apache, meanwhile, had adapted so completely to their winter environment that they seemed to have become part of the mountain landscape itself. They moved through the snow like wolves, following game trails and using natural features for concealment in ways that demonstrated generations of accumulated knowledge. Children in the Apache camp were thriving despite the harsh conditions. They had learned to read weather signs, to track animals through snow, and to find edible plants that remained available even in winter. Their education was continuing in the most challenging classroom imaginable, and they were learning lessons that no reservation school could teach. The women continued to play crucial roles in maintaining the band's survival and morale. They had developed techniques for keeping clothing and equipment dry in the extreme conditions, for treating injuries with limited medical supplies, and for maintaining the spiritual practices that kept their community strong. News of the avalanche and the Army's isolation eventually reached the outside world through Apache messengers who were able to travel, routes that remained unknown to military forces. The story spread through Native American communities across the region, further enhancing the reputation of Geronimo's band as invincible winter warriors. Morrison attempted to send messages requesting evacuation for his most seriously injured men, but the messengers he dispatched either became lost in the treacherous conditions or simply never returned. The silence from the outside world added to the psychological pressure on his remaining troops. The Apache leadership began to discuss long-term strategy beyond the immediate winter crisis. They recognized that their successful resistance had given them a unique opportunity to demonstrate to other Native American groups that effective resistance to government forces was still possible. Medical conditions in both camps had reached critical levels, but the Apache's superior knowledge of traditional healing methods gave them significant advantages. They used plant medicines that remained effective in winter conditions and employed techniques for maintaining health that had been developed over centuries of harsh climate survival. The standoff had evolved into something far beyond a simple military campaign. It had become a test of two completely different approaches to survival and warfare, with the harsh winter serving as the ultimate judge of which methods were more effective in extreme conditions. The 8th week brought a brief but false hope to Morrison's beleaguered forces when a break in the weather created a temporary window of clear skies and rising temperatures. For 3 days, the sun shone brilliantly on the snow-covered landscape, and some of the men began to believe that the worst of their ordeal might be over. They were tragically mistaken. The weather break was followed by another storm system even more severe than those that had come before. This new blizzard brought not just snow and wind, but a phenomenon known as freezing rain that turned the entire mountain range into a treacherous sheet of ice. Movement became virtually impossible, and even the most basic survival tasks became life-threatening challenges. The Apache, however, had anticipated this weather pattern. Their traditional knowledge included understanding of how winter storms moved through their territory and what signs indicated the most dangerous conditions. They had prepared their shelters and gathered additional supplies during the brief respite, while the Army forces had wasted the opportunity celebrating their imagined relief. During the freezing rainstorm, the Apache demonstrated their mastery of winter survival, in ways that seemed almost magical to any outside observer. They had techniques for creating traction on ice, for maintaining fires in conditions where moisture threatened to extinguish any flame, and for moving safely across terrain that had become a death trap for anyone lacking their specialized knowledge. Morrison lost 2 more men during this storm, bringing his total casualties to levels that would have been unacceptable in any normal military operation. Sergeant William Murphy, a 20-year veteran who had survived multiple Indian wars, slipped on the ice while attempting to check on his men and fell into a ravine where his body was not recovered for 3 days. The death of Sergeant Murphy was particularly devastating to morale because he had been one of the most experienced and respected non-commissioned officers in the command. His loss left younger soldiers feeling even more vulnerable and uncertain about their chances of surviving the winter ordeal. Lieutenant Collins made the decision to consolidate the remaining forces into a single defensive position, abandoning the pretense of maintaining any kind of siege around the Apache stronghold. The military mission had effectively ended. What remained was simply a struggle to keep the survivors alive until rescue became possible. The Apache observed this consolidation with interest, but did not attack the weakened army position. Geronimo understood that his enemies were no longer a threat, and that any aggressive action might provoke retaliation that could be costly to his own people. The winter was doing his work for him without requiring additional risk to Apache lives. Instead, the Apache focused on strengthening their own position and preparing for the eventual end of winter. They used the time to repair equipment, tell traditional stories that preserved their cultural knowledge, and train their young people in the skills they would need for continued resistance. The story of their winter resistance had already spread far beyond the immediate region. Other Apache bands, Navajo communities, and even some Mexican villages had heard tales of how Geronimo's people had turned the harsh winter into a weapon against their enemies. These stories inspired hope among indigenous communities throughout the Southwest. Dr. Harrison, the Army medical officer, had reached the conclusion that continued exposure would result in additional deaths that served no military purpose. He began preparing formal recommendations for immediate evacuation of the most severely affected personnel. Regardless of the impact on the mission, the psychological transformation within Morrison's command was complete. Men who had begun the campaign as confident soldiers pursuing what they saw as a defeated enemy now understood that they were the ones who had been defeated. The Apache had not just survived the winter, they had thrived while their enemies barely clung to life. Communications with Army headquarters remained severed due to the blocked pass and the extreme weather conditions. Morrison had no way of knowing whether relief efforts were being organized or whether his command had been written off as lost. The isolation added a layer of despair to the already overwhelming physical challenges. The Apache children, who had initially been seen as the most vulnerable members of the band, had actually adapted to the winter conditions better than many adults. They had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated dangerous weather changes, and had developed games that helped them practice survival skills while maintaining their spirits. Women in the Apache camp had become the backbone of their community's winter survival effort. They had created efficient systems for food distribution, medical care, and maintaining the social bonds that kept their people united in the face of extreme adversity. Their leadership was proving as crucial as any military strategy. As the 9th week began, it became clear that the winter siege had fundamentally changed both forces involved. The Apache had proven their ability to not just survive, but to maintain their resistance under conditions that had broken a well-equipped military force. The lesson would resonate through history and inspire future generations of indigenous resistance fighters. The winter siege finally came to an end not through military action or surrender, but through the arrival of spring and a massive rescue operation that had been organized at the highest levels of the Army command. General Nelson Miles himself had ordered the deployment of specialized mountain troops equipped with the latest cold weather gear to extract Morrison's surviving forces and bring the embarrassing campaign to a close. When the rescue party finally reached Morrison's position in early March, they found fewer than half of the original force still alive and capable of traveling. The survivors were suffering from various degrees of frostbite, malnutrition, and what military doctors would later classify as combat exhaustion. Many would never fully recover from their winter ordeal. Captain Morrison, his military career effectively ended by the failed campaign, was found in a state of physical and psychological collapse. The confident officer who had believed that Winter would be his ally in defeating Geronimo had been broken by the very forces he thought he could control. He would spend the remainder of his life in and out of military hospitals. The Apache, observed from a distance by the rescue party, appeared to be in remarkably good condition, despite having endured the same harsh winter that had devastated the army forces. They were seen moving freely through the mountain terrain, showing no signs of the desperation or weakness that military planners had confidently predicted would force their surrender. Geronimo himself was spotted standing on a high ridge, watching the evacuation of the army forces with what witnesses described as dignified satisfaction. He made no attempt to attack the vulnerable rescue operation, understanding that his point had been made more effectively through survival than through violence. The old warrior had proven that the Apache spirit could not be broken by any force that men or nature could bring against it. The news of the failed winter siege spread rapidly through military circles and eventually reached the general public through newspaper accounts that struggled to explain how a handful of Apache warriors had defeated a well-equipped army force. The story became a source of national embarrassment and led to significant changes in military strategy and equipment. For the Apache, the winter victory represented far more than a tactical success. It had proven to themselves and to other Native American communities that resistance remained possible even under the most challenging circumstances. The story of their winter stand would be told and retold for generations, inspiring others to maintain their cultural identity and resist forced assimilation. The children who had lived through the winter siege grew up to become leaders of their people, carrying with them the knowledge that they had witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen their elders turn extreme adversity into advantage and had learned lessons about survival, resistance, and cultural pride that no reservation school could have taught them. The women who had played such crucial roles in the winter survival effort were recognized within Apache society as having demonstrated leadership equal to any war chief. Their knowledge of traditional healing, food preservation, and community organization had proven as valuable as any military skill in ensuring their people's survival. Lieutenant Collins, one of the few officers to emerge from the campaign with his reputation intact, would later write in his memoirs that the winter siege had taught him more about courage and determination than any previous military experience. He described the Apache resistance as one of the most remarkable displays of human endurance he had ever witnessed. The military lessons learned from the failed winter campaign led to significant improvements in cold weather training and equipment for American forces. Ironically, the Apache knowledge and techniques that had proven so effective were studied and adapted for use by the same military that had been defeated by them. Geronimo and his followers would continue their resistance for several more months before eventually agreeing to surrender terms that were more favorable than those that had been offered before the winter siege. Their demonstration of strength during the harsh months had earned them a measure of respect from their enemies and better treatment in the negotiations that followed. The winter that was supposed to become a weapon against the Apache had instead become the forge in which their legend was shaped. Their unbroken spirit in the face of conditions that shattered their enemies became a symbol of indigenous resilience that would inspire resistance movements around the world for generations to come. Years later, when the story of the winter siege was finally told in its entirety, it would be remembered not as a military campaign, but as a testament to the power of traditional knowledge, cultural unity, and the unbreakable human spirit when facing seemingly impossible odds. The Apache had not just survived the winter, they had transformed it into their greatest victory.